안녕하십니까. 2022 여성 인권과 평화 국제 컨퍼런스 사회를 맡은 아나운서
I'm
문다연입니다.
Mundayan. I'll
반갑습니다.
be the MC of the International Conference on Women's Rights and Peace 2022.
네, 바로
It's a pleasure to
1부
meet you.
폭력의 세계 공존의 존재론
And
세션을
now we will begin
시작하겠습니다.
part 1
지금
on the
무대
world of violence,
위에는
the
일부
ontology of
사회를
coexistence.
맡아주실
On the stage,
권나영,
we have Professor
주크대
Kwon
아시아
Na-young of the
중동학과
Asian and
교수님,
Middle Eastern Studies at Duke
발표자이신
University, who will be the
이혜령
moderator.
성균관대
And we also have
동아시아
Professor
교수님,
Lee Hae-ryung at the Academy of
토론자로
East Asian Studies in
참석해주신
Seonggyungan University,
김형준
and Professor Kim Young-jung of the Department of Korean Language and Literature at Chosun University, and Professor Park So-hyun of the Seoul National University of Science Technology Graduate School of Public Policy and Information Technology. I'd like to thank all of you for sparing your precious time to be speakers at this session. And we also have Professor Tomiyama Ichiro of Toshisha University Graduate School of Global Studies, who will be with us online. I'd like to thank you for being here with us following last year's presence. And now I'd like to introduce Professor Kwon Na-young, who will moderate the first session. The mic is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. It is my pleasure to be moderating this session. My name is Na-young Amy Kwon, and I teach Korean and Japanese studies at Duke University. It is especially a pleasure for me to be moderating this morning opening session with the two distinguished speakers, Professor Tomiyama Ichiro and Professor Lee Hae-ryung. I've actually been a big fan of both of their works since I was a graduate student, and I remember just trying to catch up with all the exciting scholarship that was emerging about war crimes and colonial legacies in the East Asia and the Asia-Pacific region specifically. And I realize now, in hindsight, how much of the groundwork, the groundbreaking work, these two scholars in particular have been doing for the next generation. And as you have heard through the keynote and the introduction, opening remarks this morning, we are not only talking about the past and past atrocities and violence, but about the legacies and how we as the next generation and the students who are here today can also think about the continuities from these past and what is the responsibility of those of us who are scholars, students, writers, activists have in the aftermath. So our first presenter is Professor Tomiyama Ichiro, who is at the Toshisha University's School of Global Studies. His talk today is entitled After Violence, and his presentation will be followed directly by his discussant, Professor Kim Hyung-jun, from the Department of Korean Language and Literature at Chosun University.
はい、ご紹介ありがとうございます。
Thank you for that kind introduction. My name is Tomiyama, and I teach at Toshisha University. I have to say that it is an honor for me to be able to present at a prestigious conference like this. I'd like to thank Ellen Chung, Chung Yu-jin of the Research Institute on Japanese Military Sexual Slavery for organizing this splendid event. I also thank all the organizers for all their efforts. Actually, today I was scheduled to present in person at the conference, but because of my personal schedule, I was not able to come to Korea. My apologies for not being able to show up offline. And I would like to read from the paper that I presented before the conference begins. But I have to skip a bit because there's a lot in content given the time constraints. So I would like to talk about after violence, and I wanted to bring up the idea about experience. Certain violence can be sensed in assigning the possessive to a person's experience and deeming like X testimony. It feels rather strange that you have to assign it as X's testimony. This is what Fujita Shoujo said. He's a scholar of intellectual history. He said that within the experience, encounters, collusions, and conflicts and objects shake one's arbitrary world. An earthquake arises there, the wishful thinking descends into confusion, and desire cast into into chaos. Through the painful ordeal endangered by the chaos, the reformation of desires and hopes is carried out. And that's what Fujita Shoujo said. As you can see from Fujita's reference to an earthquake, experience carries within it external force that transcends human cognition. Experience is less a fact about what has happened before this moment, rather than the beginning of a new and unpredictable situation into which people are drawn. In addition, the domain of memory contained in experience unfolds outside the domain of language, as will be discussed later. This sort of domain represents experience, and we must truly give careful thought to the words through which it is expressed in the first place. There is the question of whether it is possible to speak under the subject X. Regarding the question of experience, it is important to consider how the external force mentioned by Fujita manifests as the impetus to a new world. The setting of X's testimony cements experience as immovable evidence. It is a command to encompass all movements and actions under X's name. And by excluding the aforementioned question, it forecloses the very possibility of a new world that may have already begun. If the wounds of violence exist imminently as experience, I'd like to explore the possibilities of new world beginnings there. When trauma becomes words and is expressed in language, new relationship or socialities may be generated. Moreover, if assigning the possessive, singular or plural, to experience and treating it as X's testimony, it forecloses such possibilities. What is the relationship between the violence that leaves wounds and the power that closes off the possibility of such experience? Can we say that kind of complicity relationship exists there? This also raises the question of how to view the post when we speak of the post-violence. But then again, it may seem to contradict what I've discussed so far, but the subject I assumes great importance when considering the temporality of the post aspect. The significance here, however, does not lie in the possessive aspect of my experience. Did the thing that happened to me really happen to me? Did it occur to me only? Did this something that happened to someone besides me not happen to me? If something is about to happen to someone at this moment, is it not something that has already happened to me? Is it not the case that what has happened to me did not happen just to me, and that what is about to happen to someone else is not only something that has happened to them? What is set in motion with the subject I can be described as a question in which the relationship between the self and the others and the past, the present, and the future tenses move back and forth in a spiral. I wish to consider this question when a question starts with me. What other possibilities does it open up? So as I think about them, I think about traumas. Let me skip a bit. Citing a discussion by Veena Das on the violence against women during the separation of India and Pakistan, Tanabe Akio pointed out that after the violence, the women were in a situation where they were forced to live alongside the same people who had abducted them, violated them, or betrayed them. Tanabe also said that in such a place, they could never speak their memories of violence. While Tanabe's discussions focus on the actors involved in specific forms of the violence, I'd like to expand a little further from here. The important thing is that it's not just a continuation of the actors who still remain present. As an example, the violence continued throughout the clearly distinguished historical periods of the independence process. I also believe that the situation of being exposed to violence continues to this day. Matters of colonialism and war are often discussed in simple schematic terms with the confrontational context, and that is why it is possible to divide historical periods. Yet sexual violence is not something that can be addressed under this schema. The former being manifested is in pair with the latter being concealed. In that sense, we must ourselves that violence does not exist solely with the violent act, and that it plants its roots in our lives post-violence.
このようなことを問わなければならないのだと思います。
And I think we should point this out as he asked a question. Tanabe said that the memories of violence is a traumatic experience, and Tanabe asked, how do people reconstruct a world where they can live daily lives when they cannot experience traumatic experiences in a language? Most of the points that I wish to explore are captured within Tanabe's question. First of all, as he notes, issues related to being unable to speak of the experience of victimization by violence have often been discussed in terms of trauma. However, the matter of being unable to express them in a language, he said, I can never talk about memories of violence. It does not solely stem from the deep wounds of violence inflicted in the past. The inability to express things in words is the result of a present-day situation in which the perpetrators of violence are still present in the same world. The same norms and institutions that enabled the violence will remain in effect, and this gives rise to the perception that the violence is and could occur again in the future. As it pertains to the matter of post-violence, the word trauma tends to predominantly be used synonymously with post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD as a reference to the profundity of the wounds. If that is all it is, it will simply be a matter of wounds that the victims must heal or cope with. Yet trauma does not belong solely to the past. It is a dynamic problem in which the effort of speaking about the events is intertwined with forces that try to foreclose that expression. So, I think the important thing is to speak, and the interlocutor and who you're going to have your voices heard is very important. And it is not just the victims that are blocked from speaking. So Tanabe talks about a world that is livable. The question of who is being listening and who the words are received are so important that people involved in situations of suppressed expressions are not only the victims, and therefore the livable world that should be constructed, as mentioned by Tanabe, does not have only to do with the victims of the past violence, but with the people who are still exposed to ongoing violence. And I believe that we should call this project of constructing such a world politics. While the politics of historical violence tend to be confined to matters of apologies and the compensation to the victims, it should also be focused on what Tanabe refers as creating a livable world and exist as a politics of the ongoing violence. In this case, how should we pose it at the starting point of such politics? Tanabe writes that non-victims must face up and accept the fact that the victims cannot comprehend violence in linguistic terms. Now, if we adopt this approach, however, it leaves the question of whether the women who suffered violence remained passive entities. Should they be accepted, while the initiative in establishing a relationship is assigning to the ones accepting them? Not being able to speak is reduced to a matter of being incomprehensible. Then the experience is fixed in the place as the victim's experience. Tanabe asks, is it possible to think of incomprehensibility as the source of latent possibilities in human life? If I sympathize with the question, I do. How can we take this incomprehensibility, how can we tie it to the construction of a world where all those exposed to violence can live? Before saying that we accept incomprehensibility, should we face up a bit more on the matter of unspeakability? For example, with regards to the testimonies of the comfort women victims, Lee Jung-hwa has said that on the unspeakability, she said that when a living individual is forced to harbor a secret, this relates to being able to continue living. This is the precarious boundary between speaking and being unable to speak. Here, the secret exists as a matter of not to be spoken. In other words, the realm of the secret, which is consciously delineated, is not to be spoken in one's life. To point out the difference from Tanabe's discussions, for Tanabe, the unspeakability refers to the impossibility of speaking. Tanabe means that something cannot be understood in linguistic terms. People must accept this incomprehensibility according to Tanabe. However, it is not a matter of impossibility, but a deliberate choice not to speak. It is staying silent in order to survive in the current situation. It's not simply a matter of misery or pain, nor of the impossibility of speaking. It's an active battle to survive. Perhaps the construction of a new world will appear as an extension of this fight that has already begun. Those who have suffered violence are not people whose traumas cannot be understood in words, or who are in the situation of being unable to express them. Rather, they're people fighting to live. Moreover, the world that arises as an extension of their struggle involves everyone who is exposed to violence. I like to establish a politics here, a politics of surviving, in which anyone may appear as a directly involved party. Next, I'd like to talk about the problem of violence. And as mentioned above, when trying to think of the memories related to the experience of violence as a linguistic matter, unspeakability often becomes the focus of the discussions. This is also about trauma and memory. But instead of simply concluding with the psychoanalytical explanation of trauma, in order to discover those who are fighting to survive and draw politics from there, I want to discuss a bit more on unspeakability in terms of Judith Butler's concept of foreclosure. What sort of battle begins when one seeks to speak or decide to remain silent? Butler's foreclosure is related first and foremost to psychoanalytic terms of rejection, in the words of Freud, or exclusion in the words of Lacan. In other words, it refers to something being excluded from the symbolic or linguistic order without being recalled, remembered, or brought into consciousness. And it may also be said that the linguistic order rests upon such a prior exclusion. Incomprehensibility is excluded from the world of language in advance as a prerequisite for comprehensibility. However, Butler tries to understand the primitive bar which demarcates the symbolic orders outside created by prior exclusion. This is done in a dynamic way instead of treating it as an immovable structure alongside psychoanalytical lines. In other words, she suggests it should be considered as continuing dynamics. Something that is embedded inside, Perhaps what emerges in the process as the wounds inflicted on one's experience begin that approaching the realm of language would be such dynamics surrounding the bar. Moreover, the situation in which foreclosed memories rise towards language may be characterized as a struggle over power, referring to the operation of power that does not approve of the movement of memory rising into words and refusing to accept speaking as speaking. Butler says that it operates to make certain kinds of citizens viable and others unviable. In addition, regarding the situation in which speakability is deprived due to foreclosure, she discusses as a perceptible state and the sense of being at risk felt by a subject when the possibility of speech is foreclosed, instead of defining as something that cannot be brought into consciousness. In considering the matter of violence, I wish to focus on the sense of being at risk. Foreclosing speakability means not acknowledging the agents of speech. Even when they speak, they're not recognized as speaking, and their message is not recognized as language. This is where the violence begins, in the realm of non-discussion. As the violence of non-discussion continues, the wounds of violence and the fear of being at risk about the future relationship, they overlap. Thus, the discovery of wounds becomes a premonition of violence, which leads in turn to the discovery of wounds. So, as you are being exposed to this violence, there's a struggle over speaking, not speaking. Being able to speak emerges over those people who continue to speak despite being exposed to violence and non-discussion. And those who hold their tongue to survive, there's a struggle. It's a process of struggle rather than a matter of incompressibility related to speakability and unspeakability. And returning to Tanabe's important question of how to reconstruct a viable everyday world in an environment where people cannot express their traumatic experiences through language, it is important to overlap this with the current situation of being exposed to the risk of violence. It does not only mean that the perpetrators of violence are still around. Violence is the cause of traumatic experience that has become inscribed, and it also means that words are foreclosed in advance. This means that exposure to violence cannot be expressed in linguistic terms, and the question is how we can reconstruct our world in this context. Before defining this unspeakability to be incomprehensibility and arguing the need to accept it, we may first need to face up to this ongoing struggle to survive. We may also have to recognize that those confronting violence and non-discussion arising in this battle are themselves exposed. Let's skip a bit and let's talk about knowing. And I quote from the words of Chung Hee-jin in my writing. She says that I believe that knowing must be hurtful. Knowing, especially knowing the history that has been deliberately expunged precisely because it is so crucially important, is bound to be hurtful because of the shame about one's life of being shielded by ignorance and because of the anger towards society and the hopelessness of communication. As Chung Hee-jin discusses here, the person who shoulders the act of knowing may already be exposed to violence. The recognition comes with an awareness of having ignored the violence to which we have been already exposed, and a sense of shame at having regarded the wounds of violence as someone else's business. As we hitherto sheltered reality crumbles, we become aware of the meaning of an order that bears violence, and we understand that there is no place to protect us from such violence. When we are aware of this, the history inscribed by violence is no longer other people's affair. The wounds are inflicted in a place where the shame of having regarded violence as other people's affair overlaps with the feeling of fear that we are already being exposed to violence, as well as the despair of not being able to quickly find our own words to resist this infuriating order. It is not a matter of previously sheltered person discovering the wounds of others. The act of knowing is wounding in and of itself. The society must be constructed with language, but what should we do to engage in linguistically based work while promulgating foreclosure and without making certain kinds of citizens viable and others non-viable as other people's business? What sort of knowing is this? What can I say at least is that because foreclosure relates to the linguistic order, knowing is accompanied by a premonition of violence. The fear of being wounded or the discovery that one is already wounded. Such forms of words may become knowledge. The knowing that accompanies wounds described by Chung Hee-jin may involve establishing a piece of language for constructing a new society, even as we remain exposed to the violence non-discussion. However, the sense of being at risk that Butler describes does not refer to the wounds of violence. Rather, it may be said to be something that elicits a more general anxiety about being wounded. Perhaps such anxiety may fuel the advent of even more powerful control mechanisms or power. Amid the ongoing violence, the wounds of violence, along with fear that we might be wounded again, may make us yearn for a strong defense organization that will protect us from being wounded. The words of knowing that we need now may be something that can create a new way forward without letting some powerful authority emerge from the physical sense of fearing violence. Wounds should not be generalized or addressed in generic terms. Instead of placing wounds in the third person, can we discover words and knowledge that start with each of ourselves? The psychiatrist Takaki Dasunsuke focused on the wounds and anguish experienced by people receiving disability support. To date, the wounds and anguish have belonged to the people receiving support, while supporters have been regarded as helpers. Regarding this distinction between the supported and supporter, Takaki attempts to locate a new path forward that begins with the suffering experienced by the supporter. In many cases, we create defensive, controlling systems of support and care in which the supporters suffer no wounds, such that the management of support leads to an abusive form of control. There, the relationship between the supported and supporter becomes cemented into a relationship of domination. The new path that Takaki insists on is, in a sense, a simple one: dialogue. It means that the individuals who embrace the wounds or suffer the fear of being wounded will search for words while talking together. On people regarded as non-disabled and people with mental illness, Takaki says that they create a new reality between them through dialogue to find the words to understand each other. The wounds are not treated in generic terms, nor are they exclusively possessed by the affected individuals. There are secrets and fears each person carries. What other path exists but to hold on to that and search for the words together? Perhaps society can only be constructed through a process of accumulated language about wounds in the relationship between you and me, and the ones between self and others. At least, to avert the society from being enveloped in monologue and to prevent our suffering and wounds from becoming voices that yearn for a more powerful authority, it is important that we come to face with the wound to begin the work of creating new relationships. The act of knowing may exist in such efforts. Takaki stresses that the dialogue must continue and it should be continually established as a space. Here, dialogue is redefined as a space in the sense of a relationship between you and me. The important thing is that the supporter is participating in that space and becoming more of a person within it rather than providing support. When it comes to the word, the wounds, this is where the words are created in a process of not individual wounds or the fear of suffering translating into the invocations of more oppressive organizations, but of a place that is constantly changing and taking on different forms through encounters with words. This is where the Takaki foresees what he calls wounded democracy. This does not mean that democratic institutions themselves are wounded, but that democracy exists together with the wounds. The wounds here are not something to be erased or feared, but a place to be drawn into. These places are linked together through wounds, and these places are numerous. They are not all alike. But these places are increasingly appearing all around. Perhaps this is what politics become. The multifocal expansion of such places will be enabled. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
김현균 선생님 말씀 부탁드립니다.
Well, Mr. Kim Hyung-gyun, Professor Kim Hyung-gyun, would you like to begin your discussion, please? Professor Kim Hyung-jun. Yes, I will begin my discussions. I'm a discussant designated for Professor Tomiyama. My name is Kim Hyung-jun. I was hoping to meet Professor Tomiyama in person. I rose very early in the morning. Usually this is the time of the hour I wake up normally, but I had to wake up very early in the morning to ride a train from Gwangju to come to here. I met Professor Tomiyama 7 years ago. If you don't mind, I'd like to remove my mask and begin my discussion. So I prepared a text, and it was a very intellectually intriguing text. I don't have a lot, so let me read from the text. As Professor Tomiyama may already know, there's a Korean writer named Kim Sum. She is a prolific writer who works on a series of novels dealing with the Japanese military comfort women victims. I once wrote in an article that the first-person observer point of view was where the writer who took on a literary conundrum of testimony and construction, which is what Professor Tomiyama said, as a problem, and she finally reached there. Although the naming was obscure and narrow, I don't indicate it just as a fictional device. Recently, I found a sentence that most adequately expresses the meaning I sought to convey in the aforementioned comment. It unfolds like this. The event is happening by my side, where it is no longer someone else's concerns. And I quote from Professor Ichiro Tomiyama. This is a subtitle of his essay, What Comes After the Testimonies, War, Women, and Violence. And, of course, the sentence comes from Professor Tomiyama, and come to think of it, by saying the term first person, I seem to have meant that the testimony is not just other people's affair. The term observer's point of view, I seem to have wanted to convey the meaning that testimony cannot be entirely my or X's memory. Kim Soom is an author and interviewer listening to and recording the testimonies of comfort women victims as a matter of taking place next to me, but not limited to others, with the persisting premonition of violence. In other words, while reading the works of Kim Soom, I was making remarks similar to what you said in series your works, Professor. Maybe we have already been the comrades from a distance, and I met you a long time ago, and it's an honor for me. The introduction is a bit worded because although today's discussion contains a few questions, I want to clarify that questions are not intended for refutation or criticism. You said knowing is to secure a language that constructs a new society, even while being exposed to the violence of non-discussion. I think today's discussion also attempts to secure a place for such a language. And in the following comment, I was raising questions to myself, and a question that may come without an answer, but I do have some questions for the Professor Tomiyama. Taking your presentation as an excuse, I'd like to pose it questions I've always had for a long time. First of all, I'm curious about your views on ethics and politics. Attempt to distinguish the two may be meaningless or impossible in itself. However, I often want to tell the difference between the two. According to my distinction, politics is primarily collective, whereas ethics is most likely to be of individual origin. For example, just as class ethics sounds awkward, so there's the term politics of hospitality. Likewise, the ethics of dispute is incongruent, so is the politics of bartleby. I'm obsessed to such a distinction despite the risk of make a discussion a bit exhausting, because I believe that modern political and social thoughts have evolved in the trend of transition politics to ethics since the decline of Marxism, or since the exhaustion of possibilities of collective politics. It is the interest in politics has shifted to that in ethics. In other words, ethics has taken place of politics, and under the circumstance, the ethical subject is often introduced as a converted individual. And then, I guess we can speculate that ethics is the product of a desperate attempt to find a place for the political, through which ethics occupied the position previously held by the politics. In today's presentation and your other works, of course, ethics and politics are of course indistinguishable, pointing out the insufficiency of the concept of trauma, which is defined only as incomprehensibility. You say as follows: those who have suffered violence, not people whose traumas can not be understood in the words, or who are in the situation of being unable to express them. Rather, they are people fighting to live. Moreover, the world that rises is an extension of their struggle, involves everyone who is exposed to violence. I like to distinguish politics here. Therefore, those who are aware that violence is no longer someone else's problem, de-identified and ethical subjects, seek a violence-free world. They fight against ongoing foreclosure while feeling the premonition of persisting violence. And this is the meaning of politics that you suggest from what I see. But I still have a question, which is also about recent discourses on ethics in general. If so, under what social and institutional conditions, who will readily take over and get involved in violence against others as their own challenge, and why would they do that? Unless they want to leave it up to chance, like resurrected Jesus who appeared to Paul. I have another question. The premonition of violence appears to be a concept that plays an essential role in your thinking. It is a very concept that mediates me and others, and also connects ethics and politics. However, while reading your essay for today's conference, I could also find your reflective concerns about the concept. For example, you say, perhaps such anxiety may fuel the advent of even more powerful control mechanisms or power. Amid ongoing violence, the wounds of violence, along with the fear that we might be wounded again, make us yearn for a strong defense organization that will protect us from being wounded. Similar to Giorgio Agamben's recent assertions in the post-COVID-19 world, these sentences seem to suggest that you are concerned about the voluntary demand of the state of exception. It is perfectly legitimate concern from your standpoint, which often identifies biopolitics with necropolitics. However, I feel the need to emphasize that Michel Foucault did not equate biopolitics with the politics of death or the politics of the state of exception. For Foucault, biopower is basically the power to make people live. However, when cost efficiency decreases, it is the power to let people die. Hence, it is the power to reduce the people to biological populations and then govern them by operating safety mechanisms according to statistics and probability. In that sense, I'm more concerned about the possibility that the premonition of violence may increase the number of insurance subscribers exponentially, but then by the fact that it may deprive people of the wish for a strong defense organization. That is to say, it is a situation in which the premonition of violence is not politicized but embraced as a functional element in biopolitical governmentality. That's because what insurance capital calls risk is not anything but premonition of violence. Neoliberalism, which Foucault views as a contemporary version of biopolitics, knows how to bring over the omnipresent possibility of violence to a safety mechanism. Risk, any possible violence, disaster, accident, or disease, is by itself capital and preventable misfortune. Additionally, this tendency will reinforce itself rapidly in the post-COVID-19 world because it looks quite obvious that the era we live in the future will suffer from hypochondria, like a sort of transient mental illness. It is questionable how premonition of violence will defend ethically and political motivation from the biopolitical governmentality when such concerns are realized. The last question I have is the one I'm asking you with anticipation. In your thinking, knowing appears to be differentiated from knowledge. In other words, getting to know is both a practical and performative act. In the introduction to your beautiful book, Beginnings, Fanon, Critically Situated, which was published in South Korea 2 years ago, I found the following sentences. I yearn for creating a medium that can secure the practice of reading, writing, in which each of us will serve as a momentum. In other words, it's a magazine mediating a place to talk without worries, to expand us in a multifocal manner without presupposing abandoned others. The title of the magazine is MFE, Multifocal Expansionismus. I wonder what the magazine means to you and how much progress has been made in its efforts towards knowing. This concludes my discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for Professor Tomiyama for his enlightening presentation and to Professor Kim Hyun-jung for his discussion. This meeting has been prepared for by multiple hands and support groups, and I'd like to take this time to extend a thanks for everyone, including those who have prepared the booklets and the translations. It's not easy to be able to communicate with one another in these multiple languages, and there is an extraordinary amount of labor involved in bringing a gathering like this together. I think it's also significant to recognize that labor precisely because of the type of engagements that these scholars have been engaged with one another over the years. For example, Professor Kim just mentioned that he has been a fan and a reader of Professor Tomiyama's work for decades, and that, of course, is enabled through the inordinate amount of labor of translation. Professor Tomiyama raised important questions regarding the politics and ethics of speakability and unspeakability after violence and atrocity. The questions of who gets to speak and whose responsibility it is to speak are not limited to the immediate victims and survivors. This responsibility pertains to all of us, especially when we consider the ongoing violence all around us, still entailed in the continued force of silencing that still persists. Professor Tomiyama asks, how do we engage in dialogue in a dynamic and ethical manner in the face of ongoing violence that impacts us all in variable ways? How do we avoid perpetuating violence of our own by enacting forms of silencing, not only towards the survivors, but among ourselves as the next generation and as supporters of the movement? In his discussion, Professor Kim raised at least 4 different relevant questions and issues, including the relationship between the individual ethics and collective politics, the location of the speaker and the listener or the interlocutors in terms of the first or third person perspective, and about how new alternative or radical forms of engagements have been opened up in new ways of forming community and dialogue. So we look forward to some of Professor Tomiyama's responses after our second presentation. Our second presenter is Professor Lee Hae-ryung, who is at the Sungkyunkwan University's Academy of East Asian Studies. Professor Yee's talk is entitled Ruins, Memories of the Sea, Can the Japanese Military Comfort Women Be Counted? Her talk will be followed immediately by her discussant, Professor Park So-hyun, who is a professor at the Seoul National University of Science and Technology. Her comments are titled Incapacitation of Politics of Numbers and Mainstreaming of the Representation of the Memories of the Japanese Military Comfort Women.
Just has been introduced, I'm Hae-ryung Lee. Professor Kwon Na-young said at the beginning of this conference, well, she kind of introduced me as someone very senior, but as we studied together in the past, we wrote our doctoral thesis together. We were researchers working together. And as we meet today here together, I think it is a great pleasure, and I feel deeply moved. I listened to the keynote speech of Ms. Nastya and also Professor Tomiyara Ichiro's presentation just now. And as I look back on the comments, I think that somewhat my presentation is somewhat shortcoming. Nevertheless, I will do my best to read through my presentation. The title is Ruins, Memories of the Sea, and I will talk about this later on. The Memories of the Sea is a work of Tomiyaka Taiko. It's the title of the painting. And Carol Clark has observed that the remembering of the World War II late last century turned the war of the past into a matter of present-day political and cultural interest, so that by 1990s, the Japanese military comfort women issue, like the Holocaust or Hiroshima, had transcended local and regional borders to become part of transnational memory with social, legal, and moral consequences. And the crucial factor factor in this trial process was the coming out of Kim Ak-sun as a comfort women survivor on August 14, 1991. In her first testimony, Kim said that she feels grieves and heart races whenever I see a Japanese flag. And when asked by a reporter on a television program on August 20th of that same year for her thoughts on the Japanese government's denial of the first very existence of the comfort women, she says that I hope some of those who were there with me will come forward. I don't know their Korean names. I only record the Japanese name they used there. I still remember them. I'd be happy if just one of them stepped forward. When I saw the Japanese flag raised like that, I feel my heart sank. I feel so astonished. I still hear that damned Hinomaru. They say Tenno Heika Hinomaru so many times that these words stuck in my ears. I was trampled on by that damned Hinomaru, and my whole life has been like this. And this statement is not simple. In one statement, she addressed the collective existence and alienating nature of the Japanese military comfort women, the lifelong temporality of the memories, and the war and the symbols that mediate them. Kim wanted the women who were there with her to come forward and testify themselves as witnesses. But that sort of dramatic development did not occur. Did she really not know the Korean names of those other women? Or did she know their names but feel that she could not reveal them? Of the three former comfort women included among the 35 plaintiffs in a December 1991 lawsuit spearheaded by the Association of Pacific War Victims and Bereaved Families to demand compensation for Korean victims of the Pacific War in Asia, Kim was the only one who gave her real name, while the other two kept their secret. In a press conference delivered after the filing at the Tokyo District Court, she said, "After arriving in Japan last night, I couldn't sleep because of the overwhelming emotions. I was fortunate enough to escape, but my co-workers were left behind to die." Being left to die and coming forward, and the difficulty of this. Her testimony, this is the essence. And she was also very agitated when she talked about the national flag. As she talked about the Hinomaru, she feels a dictionary hallucination and feels pain in her heart. And what kind of memory did she remember? And when she spoke, where was she and when was she? Kim also spoke about the Japanese flag at the gathering to hear Kim Ak-sun's testimony event held at the Tokyo YWCA on December 9, 1991, organized by the Women's Network on the military comfort women issue. I feel at rage just looking at the Japanese soldiers, and when I look at the Hinomaru, I feel so dumbfounded. When I was on the airplane, I saw that, well, I came here, I flew on a JR plane. I didn't know, they told me to take an airplane, so I took the airplane. But when I looked outside the wing, I looked outside and saw the red Hinomaru on the wing. The Hinomaru was a symbol for Japan, the country that has waged war and forced her into battlefield comfort station. The Hinomaru was a medium of affective memory and a memory image which will reawaken the experience of war that Japan has begun and caused her to shudder. Kim's last interview, recorded in July 1997, reveals what caused her astonishment. During the interview, what was impressive was that before she came to the testimony, she said that she hesitated because, along with the embarrassment caused by the social stigma associated with the patriarchal gender norms applied to women, but also because she explained that she hesitated for so long because of the fear of death. The greatest fear was that the killing, the Japanese killing people, that's the thing that had me shaking the most. I saw it so many times. I saw it after being taken. I saw people being killed so many times. And so frightening to seeing them kill. I was so scared of that killing that I couldn't speak when I was young, even if I wanted. But now that I'm older, I'm so angry and resentful. Imagine living without being able to tell the world, I thought that if I spoke like this, I might end up being killed by the Japanese. But the reason I decided I had to speak before I die is that I worried there wouldn't be anyone else to speak for me. Having listened to Kim's voice over and over and having read her words over and over, transcribing them, I came to understand that she remained silent until her life near its end due to the fear that she might be killed by the Japanese if she revealed herself and spoke out. Until her end, the struggle for testimony was a repeated performance of the affective experience of recalling the war and the battlefield. It was repeated to figure out whether the war initiated by Japan, a country that might rob her of her life, had really ended, and whether this moment was here and now, was now in fact the battlefield. She had to declare herself a comfort woman to attest to a war in which she had been unable to protest, even as countless lives were lost. The moment they were spoken, the testimonies of the former comfort women returned them to the heart of the conflict, inscribing memories of the war which could never be forgotten or erased, that left everyone aghast. They showed ruins of the war that had until then been unimaginable. While I do not intend to expand on this point in this presentation, I would like to say that historical denialism is the erasure and denial of the astonishment of the denialists themselves, as someone who could only be astonished at the memory image of those ruins. The best that the denialists seek to deny such ravages can offer is to travel back before the frozen time of the Kim Il-sun's and point out that women in colonized Korea were impoverished before Japan went to war against China. In her conversation with Kim Il-sil, Carol Clark recently shared her optimistic view that the Japanese government's loud protests, which are staged each time a comfort woman statue is raised around the world, have only served to raise awareness of the comfort woman issue among listeners around the world and underscore the symbolic meaning of the organized system sexual slavery. To rephrase that in my terms, this suggests that the Japanese government and the conservatives are compulsively affirming the memory images of those ruins which astonished them with the statues. The statues around the world also spring from a context in which the ruins recalled by the comfort women's experience cannot be confined to any one city or place. And I'll move on to the second chapter. And this is my citation. This is on the natural history of destruction. This is from Walter Benjamin's on the concept of history. This is an astonished angel of history.
독일 작가 제발트
The German author Sebald, in his book on the natural history of destruction, quotes this famous passage from Benjamin's on the concept of history. He also juxtapises the angel of history with the record of Alexander Pludge, who as a boy witnessed his hometown of Halberstadt being destroyed by the Allied air raids throughout Germany during World War II. Also,
리사 요네야마 선생님도 베냐민의 역사의
and Lisa Yoneyama also referred to Benjamin's angel of history in referring to the ruins of the atomic bomb dropped in Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and the ruins of the World Trade Center after the attacks of September 11, 2001. She criticized the politics of memory surrounding these two sets of ruins, noting that while they differed in terms of region, they both created a sort of amnesia toward our history and past of imperialist aggression. She also pointed out that the remembrance of Hiroshima as a symbol of peace failed to pose questions about the history that led to the atomic bomb being dropped, namely the tendency to disregard Japanese colonialism, imperialism, and militarist aggressions. She also criticized the presence and responsibility of the U.S. as a party responsible for dropping the atomic bomb in Japan and supporting Osama bin Laden as a contributing factor to 9/11 are not questioned. And citing this part on the answer on the angel, the two authors both advocate the remembering of World War II, and they reflect on the forms of thoughts in the philosophy of history that might open up moral horizons for remembering and mourning the dead by exploring the realm of memories of the ruins. rooms. According to Yoneyama, Benjamin's history criticized modern history writing, which creates a list of past events and things that actually happened, and standardized them as though history lacked any alternative possibilities. Benjamin's history also raises questions about historical inevitability by illuminating countless counterpoints. Revolutionary now times in the familiar process of historical progression is different from the modern historical narrative. While I agree with these ideas, I would also like to think further about the following questions. When and where are the runes revealed through the testimony battlefield of Kim Il-sung and the former comfort woman? Who is the angel of history looking at those runes? It is the Kim Il-sung and other comfort women and us. And while it is clear that these runes are the ravages of war, they cannot be denoted of names of places such as Hiroshima or Halberstadt. They are not cities, regions, or villages that allows us to debate how they should be reconstructed or commemorated. The runes Kim attested to are not her hometown, which may be the Chinese province of Jilin, where she was born, or Pyongyang, where she spent her childhood. They're not the foreign French concession in Shanghai, where she married and bore two children. They're not so when she arrived on a boat as a war victim and managed to survive before losing her daughter and her husband and also their son in Korea. And it was nowhere in South Korea, the country she had to live in, where she could not speak of what the comfort stations were. None of these could be the answer. There are ruins with no place for debris or bodies to rest and no destination to visit. In that sense, we can envision the image of ruins revealed by the comfort woman as being less like a land and more akin to the scene. In the painting series titled The Memories of the Sea of artist Mama Taiko presents this very image of ruins. The Memory of the Sea series focuses on the theme of Korean comfort women. Especially the night of the Festival of the Galuggan depicts the comfort women who were left behind at the bottom of the South Pacific Ocean without ever returning home. They head into the sea on the festival day on the Indonesian island Bali, joining Japanese soldiers still in uniform, people from the surrounding waters, and other comfort women to pass judgment on the violence of war. On the canvas, every element, the comfort women who live on after death at the bottom of the sea, skeletons of Japanese soldiers, Hinomaru guns, objects of shamans, indigenous people, fish, birds, and trees all face forward. Rebecca Copeland writes of this scene, the frenetic energy implied by the festival has been frozen, stopped in place. The birds' flight, the parading women, the murmurs of the prayers, they are all arrested. They are silenced by history. Perhaps what the angel of history saw in this, in the ruins of himself. And Kim Il-sung lived a life of silence, stripped of every land in which she lived. Her body represented the only place where she could show those runes, and by speaking out and revealing that body, she was able to reveal the runes' identity. The Japanese military comfort women became a thread connecting all the different places where the war initiated by Japan was waged, the land, the mountains, the sea, and the island, and tying together the people seeking to remember the war anew. We might say that she became the founder of a new community or polis that had never existed before. The fact that this community has no territorial borders is what has enabled comfort women statues to be raised all over the world. And can the Japanese military comfort women be counted? Yoneyama also says that I think it is important that the angel in Benjamin's description must move forward. Upon rereading on the concept of history, it encourages us to consider that the angel cannot close his wings, yet the storm irresistibly propels him into the future to which his back is turned. What I wish to emphasize here is that the angel of history has not turned his back. By not turning his back, he exists simultaneously in the past and present. Give me back my youth, Kim Il-sung said. This does not simply mean that the past cannot be restored or turned back. It means that in critical reflections on history, we must accurately consider the subject of the subjunctive. When we unreflectively talk about the overlapping of patriarchy with poverty in colonial Korea along
동원
with
사기나
school
사기에
factories
주된
and making money
레포토리,
which were
학교,
used for the
공장,
fraudulent
공법인 등을
mobilization of comfort
비상식적으로
women,
공급할 때
what ends up concealed
피해자들이
is the
애초에
fact
살해할 필요조차
that the
없었던
victims were
존재들로
regarded as objects
간주되었음은
that were
은폐되고
not
있습니다.
even needed to be
얼마나
counted.
어떻게 어디서 모집되었는지 동원되는지
The basic
어디로
position of the
갔는지 그
Japanese
정보를
government and
증명할
historical
증거
denialists
따위는
is that there's
없다는
no
것이
evidence to document how many women were
일본정부나
recruited,
국내외 역사
mobilized,
부정주의자들의
how or
기본
where, or to show
이들은
where they
발굴
went.
공개된
They
증거는
present the
부분적인
argument
것이고 피해의
that
주장은
because only
과장되거나
partial
말소된
evidence has been discovered,
논리라는
the
것을
claims of the
합니다.
victimization
그런데
must be exaggerated or false.
그런 따위의
But consider
증거
this, the very lack or absence of evidence ironically manifests that the Japanese military comfort women were uncountable objects. There were never any need to tally their lives and deaths. The estimates suggesting that there were more than 200,000 Korean comfort women are based on the numbers of the Japanese military units. In contrast with the difficulty of establishing the precise scale of the comfort women's mobilization, the estimate of the Koreans called into the Japanese army are very concrete. How is it possible to count them in such detail? Takashimi Fujitani argues that the wartime mobilization of Koreans made them a population worthy of life, health, reproduction, and health and happiness. In other words, they were incorporated into the regime of governmentality and biopolitics. This claim, of course, is not free from problems, as Koreans' deaths were not counted. Anyway, this suggests that the Korean comfort women were not Koreans who were incorporated into Japan as a population worthy of life, health, reproduction, and happiness. And this characteristic is not exclusive to them. Herein lies the fundamental reason for the uncountability. The classification of these uncountable individuals as countable, visible, and recognizable came as a result of a movement to address the comfort women issue that was set in motion by the coming out of Kim Il-sung and other survivors, and by the reporting and registration of victims with the South Korean government in response. This reporting and registration rendered the victims and survivors a countable category. Also, the reporting and registration were accompanied by the process of coming out and testimony. The registration led to testimony, and what we could see in Korea, we could see the collections of the testimonies from the Japanese military comfort women were based on the accounts of the victims who went through the reporting and registration procedures. Counting the comfort women survivors and the reliance on the categorization of comfort women survivors as subjects of legal registration by the South Korean government may now have reached its limits. The reporting and registration approach is exclusive in the sense that the final certification of victimhood is based on institutional government procedures in South Korea. Also, it may be seen as having subtly contributed to an attitude in which borders of nationalities are applied to the comfort women, so their suffering and significance are weighted differently. And tomorrow, Kim Young-kyung will make a presentation, and I would like to briefly cite her presentation in my presentation. Certain implications in this sense can be found in the life of Bae-bong-gi as a figure that were not needed to be counted. According to Kim Young-kyung, the life and death of Bae-bong-gi as a Japanese military comfort woman who did not or could not return home was a product of the forces of the post-colonial Cold War regime. And under this regime, the comfort women issue was rendered invisible, and the subaltern silence was perpetuated amid the entanglements of the hierarchy among U.S., Japan, and South Korea. She also stressed the necessity of the perspective on comfort women beyond national boundaries. The website of the South Korean Ministry of Gender Equality and Family includes a simple chart showing the comfort women survivors in terms of the number of support recipients in the country's various sites and provinces.
무엇보다도
And
인간공화국의 국가의
my concern is that we're
경제를
progressing
기르는
towards
것은
the skeletonization of the comfort women movement's significance. Most important, we must keenly be aware of how the drawing of national borders on the comfort women issue can be associated in a larger sense with the substance of the working of nationalism as a war machine. The ruling party in South Korea succeeded in taking the presidency by exploiting anti-feminist sentiment while attributing the growing anxieties associated with the neoliberal order's entrenchment to generational and gender conflicts. Well, I did not mention this in my paper, but as I wrote my paper, as a matter of fact, the Korea-US-Japan's military alliance issue has also emerged publicly. Also,
여성가족부는 일본군 위안부 문제를 평화와 여성 인권을 위한 것으로 세계에 알린 한국 여성운동가 페미니즘의
the Ministry of
부단한 실천의 결실이기도 합니다.
Gender equality and family is also part of the Korean women's movement and feminist consciousness, which raised global awareness of the comfort women issue for the sake of peace and women's rights, human rights. The situation unfolding in South Korea is one in which the meaning of the comfort women movement has become separated from feminism and entangled with the backlash phenomenon, as well as denialism and hatred from conservatives. I do not want to criticize or advocate a certain administration, because the only difference between the two administrations in approaching the comfort women issue has been whether they have allowed it to escalate it into a diplomatic issue between South Korea and Japan. And we see that Korea is now emerging as a weapons exporter in recent years, and this drive has been pushed not only by the current administration but also by the Moon Jae-in administration. As the war in Ukraine continues, news reports describe the signing of arms sales contracts with Poland as a bonanza. Referred with terms such as K-weapons and K-defense, the Korean-made weapons spreading beyond Asia and the Middle East and into Europe has quickly established themselves as banal nationalism item on par with K-culture. Under these circumstances, no contradiction is seen between remembering the Japanese military comfort women on the one hand and profiting from arms sales on the other. Those who content themselves with a national narrative of economic recovery, growth, and the rebuilding of cities and estates from their post-war ruins offer a back projection of the economic narrative, characterizing comfort women as women who were trying to earn money. In addition to the deceptive view of war as something serious and noble in both victory and defeat, this also reflects a particularly shameless and heinous mentality that foists on poor female colonial subjects, the logic of modernity inherited to colonialism. Kim Young-ok justifies his the narrative in the thesis 15 on the concept of history, which in her interpretation of the Benjamin's angel of history. She says that what strikes the homogeneous and empty times each minute is here and now, which enables a revolutionary recollection in which we wake from the nightmare of capitalism. Memories of the sea comfort women who have sunk into the sea and died yet remain alive, their bones, Japanese soldiers, guns and other objects, shamans, indigenous people, fish, birds and trees. The recollective message of ruins that these uncountable entities have created will be the end to all wars and the downfall of a phallocentric world order that pursues violent expansion. And this concludes my presentation. Well, should I move on with my discussion?
앞서 소개받은 박소연이라고
I'm Park Soyeon,
합니다.
just has been introduced.
먼저 이
First of all,
여성인권과 평화 국제 컨퍼런스에 초대를
I'd like to
해주셔서
thank you for inviting me to the International Conference on Women's Rights and Peace. It's a very meaningful moment for me. Well, I was in the
사람이다 보니까
I used to study aesthetics and art history and philosophy of art, so I don't think it is a very frequent opportunity for me to be here like this. As I listened to the keynote speeches as well as the presentation of Professor Domiyama and Professor Lee Hae-ryung, which led to my discussion paper, I got to learn so many things and inspired me to think of many other issues. So I'd like to thank all the presenters and speakers, and I'd like to move on and begin my discussion paper. The title is Incapacitation of the Politics of Numbers and the Mainstreamization of the Japanese Military Comfort Women Memory Representation. The incapacitation of politics of numbers is actually my kind of summary towards the question raised by Professor Lee Hae-ryung. And regarding this question and issue, and when we think of the memory representation of the Japanese military comfort women, I'd like to make a proposal that they should be in the mainstream. So that is the background of my title. And I will focus on my discussion paper and go on with my presentation. The article is a critique urging critical reflection on the institutionalized politics and historical negationism, which reduced the memory struggle of the Japanese military comfort women to number of survivors. It is also an attempt to problematize the points at which symbols or representations surrounding the memory, administrative measures, or official history taken by the nation-state have monopolized the truth effect while segmentalizing and superficializing the memories of war. In this context, the question of can the Japanese military comfort women be counted is an intensive and powerful counter-question. So I'll skip some parts. On the next page, regarding this question, the question is aimed at facing up to the revealed limitations of the institutionalized memory and seeking a direction that would not skeletonize the meaning of the comfort women movement. And I think that is why it is very practical and very practice-based. The number of the Japanese military comfort women victims has exerted greater power as a kind of existence proof as a basis for calling for national responsibility. It was impossible from the start to quantify the full extent of those who were deliberately concealed in official documents, who were killed on the battlefield or in other places without being recorded, or who, despite being alive, have not been able to speak of their experiences of victimization. So it was indispensable that the comfort women movement, which began with Kim Il-sung's testimony and an institution of litigation, and then demanded an apology from the state, introduced the politics of numbers as a strategy to visualize and support the surviving victims. However, the non-persistence of the number of surviving victims, and further the advent of a point when they can no longer be represented by numbers, inevitably calls for a different politics of numbers or a different approach beyond the politics of numbers. So, the French historian Pierre Nora remarked that an increasingly rapid slippage of the present into a historical past that is gone for good, that is, the acceleration of history, that is not a simple, and that was not simply a metaphor. He reminded us that the period when the peasant, who can be said to be the representative of a group integrated with memory, gained great popularity as an object of historical study, coincided with the apogee of industrial growth. The disappearance of a group or society integrated with memory was accompanied by the end of the ideologies incorporated with memory, which either carried the past into the future or gave a clear indication of what the past needed to be kept in order to prepare for the future. In this respect, the aging of surviving victims and their decline in number cannot be irrelevant to a variety of signs that the politics of numbers is incapacitated and that the comfort woman movement is skeletonized. And the same applies to the changes in government policies from livelihood stability support to the various commemorative projects. In this context, visualizing and currentizing memory through commemorative projects as a way of representation indicates that the present is a phase of transition from direct memory to indirect memory, and that such representation is not simply a supplement to memory, but becoming the core of collective memory, historicizing the comfort women issue for the generations to come. These focus on Tomiyama-type symbolic visual images instead of the politics of numbers, reminds us of Nora's suggestion as a history of representation for positivist national history. Regarding that, Nora described that the representative, the symbolic, and the interpretive have their own events, chronology, and study. He also pointed out that such representations, which were the hidden side of history, epistemological blind sides, the foundation of existence, and the unique condition of possibility, were seemingly too banal and obvious to be the subject of full-scale research. Of course, since then, various studies have been actively conducted from the point of view of the politics of commemoration and memory. Yet, despite the expansion of research of such banal representations of the nation-state, just as Kim Eun-kyung pointed out, the research on the historical museum of sexual slavery by the Japanese military and its representation has yet to bear fruit, and the discussion on how to represent the trauma of comfort women has not even begun. And given how the state has dealt with and imparted meaning to the comfort women issue through war memorials and museums, I think this point is still valid.
지금 대한민국 정부가 건립 운영하거나 그에 준하는
The public or the government-run museums or memorials, comfort women's representation is very exclusive and limited.
한국의 박물관 기념관이 채택해온 관행적인 전시 문법.
There are the spectacle type of diorama type of exhibition strongly portrays this point.
제가 말씀으로만 드리면
So just to add on to this, maybe it might be something difficult to understand. So I brought up some video images. For example, in 1980s, because of the distortion of the historical facts of Japan, the Independence Hall was founded, and this has a nationalistic narrative of the history from the prehistoric times to liberation, following the roots of the nation, the ordeal, the outcries, and the peaceful nation, the restoration of nation, and the establishment of a new nation. And the exhibition related to comfort women was included as a part of the ordeal of the nation, as you can see in this exhibition. The Independence Hall of Korea has an experience zone. It also has many video clips and mannequins. So the exhibition hall itself kind of looks like an experience on itself. The dioramas especially gives the greatest weight to the description of the armed struggle against Japan. The weapons and military uniforms used during the war are displayed together, and these dioramas would be undistinguishable from the conventional war dioramas without exhibit panels displaying that they are reproductions of armed anti-Japanese struggles. Most portraits and mannequins are predominantly male, and so are the representation of resistance fighters. When the museum was reorganized in 2009, the Comfort Women exhibition corner was created to display miniatures depicting scenes of forced abduction and comfort stations, along with the historical records. As you can see in this image, as they're being forcibly pushed up to the truck. As Kim Eun-kyung pointed out, the exhibition was conducted in a way that represents the comfort woman as a symbol of national harm by excluding the multi-layerness of the experience of the Japanese military comfort woman and highlighting only the coloniality. Also, the War Memorial of Korea, as you can see, which is the only comprehensive museum of war history in South Korea that provides a view of 5,000 years of the national history, has permanent exhibitions in the Memorial Hall, the War History Room, the Korean War Room, the Expeditionary Forces Room, Armed Forces Room, and the Large Equipment Room, and the Korean Defense Industry Room. And it exhibits various weapons and military goods along with the war dioramas and documentary paintings. It is also a space to honor and commemorate the achievements of the martyrs and the patriarchal heroes. However, there is no place for the comfort woman in the war history covered by the War Memorial of Korea. And also, in the case of the National Museum of Korea Contemporary History, which deals with the history from 1894 to the present, there is an exhibition that explores a history ranging from the period where the people realized that they were the owners of the state and sought to create a modern nation to the present day when they questioned the new boundary of the nation state. Of course, there isn't an image in my presentation, but there's no exhibition related to the comfort women either.
국가나 민족의 틀을 주축으로 하는 국립.
So the National Museum of the contemporary of Korean contemporary history, and also the Independence Hall of Korea and the National Women's History Exhibition Hall puts only a limited exhibition of the comfort women issue. And at the time of the construction of the war and women's human rights movement museum, the attempt to build the Comfort Women Museum on the site of the Sadaemun Independence Park was ultimately frustrated by the opposition of the independence movement groups, which argued that building the museum in the sacred site would be unacceptable. This is closely related to why there's no place for comfort women in the permanent exhibitions of these memorial halls and museums. And amid the current situations in which the politics of number is being neutralized, we need to raise the question of how to mainstream the existence of comfort women and their struggle to testify, which have contributed to the reflection of and change in the perception of war, state and nation and community and history. In that sense, as we see the incapacitation of the politics of numbers, the also leads to contributes to mainstreaming the comfort women issue in the exhibitions and these museum and memorials narratives. Well, this is a very well-known publication, so I'm sure you all are aware of this.
스베틀라나 알렉시에비치의 전쟁은 여자 얼굴을 하지
It's Spectra Electrolyt's publication. The war does not have a face of women. The situation of war is very male-dominated. It requires very male-dominant element and factor. But even after the war ends, for decades and decades, the women that attended the war could not speak up, even though they were at the site of the battlefield. So as we read this war, we feel that not only the war itself, but also the way we narrate and talk about the war does not have the face of the women. So the Independence Hall or the War Memorial, when we think of these and their way of remembering war and commemorating war, should also change.
독립기념관이나 전쟁기념관이 실질적으로는 평화를 표방하고 있습니다.
Independence Hall.
그럼에도 불구하고 그 많은 전투 장면과 무기 저장고
When we think of the Independence Hall and also the National and the War and the National Museum of Korea Contemporary War, they all promote peace as an important keyword, but it is exceedingly paradoxical that they are being staged with so many battle scenes and weapons storage. And among the works of Jugaharu Fujita, Master of War documentary paintings, most of which were confiscated by the U.S. and sealed for a long time after Japan lost the war, the suicidal Attu Island depicted a disastrous defeat in the Pacific War, in which only 29 out of the 2,900 Japanese soldiers survived and became prisoners. And the work was painted even before this was published in the media, and it became one of his masterpieces. And it does not depict the heroic demonstration. You can't even tell between who are the enemies and allies. We can't even see who are dead or who are alive in this brown, monotonous picture with dead bodies. Even from the point of the Japanese military, they couldn't be sure whether they could display this picture even though they ordered it. And even from the US, this war documentary painting failed to become a propaganda from the point of the Japanese military. So, even in the midst of war, battles and deaths in war could not be simplified as heroic victories and sacrifices. And this picture tells that beyond the level of realistic or graphic representations of forced abduction and comfort stations and maximization of visual effects, we should ask for a shift in perspective on war, history, state, nation, ethnicity, people, gender, and sexual violence that penetrate the exhibition narratives of mainstream museums and memorials. It is not just about the visualization of the effects of forced mobilization or abduction. We should consider to shift our perspective on war, history, and ethnicity. The testimonies of comfort women victims and the questioning and reflection on the war and sexual violence raised by their movement should not be inserted as a part of an exhibition of leading museums and memorials. They should be mainstreamed as an opportunity and perspective to fundamentally restructure the grammar of these extremely self-evident and banal representation. Well, regarding this, I thought a lot, and I'd like to ask a question to Professor Lee Ae-ryung. You emphasized that the experience of victimization of comfort women is intrinsically connected to the fear of death caused by war, and that the ruins of the war can be revealed through their bodies, which cannot be specified in time and space or easily demarcated by borders. And she evoked the images of Tomiyama Daiko's Memories of the Sea as a suggestion from this point of view. And I think this is in line with what I'm thinking. Your perspective of the recollective message of runes that these uncountable entities have created, and the end to all wars, and the downfall of the phallocentric world order that pursues violent expansion intervene, and how can it be mainstream in the mainstream museum and memorial exhibitions? And this is my question given to Professor Lee Ae-ryung. With that, I'd like to conclude.
두 분 발표 잘 들었습니다.
Thank you for the discussion.
Sorry, I was supposed to speak in English. It's hard to switch. Okay, going back. Professor Lee Ae-ryung's presentation asked us to consider the ongoing challenges of counting and recounting the experiences of the comfort women and those who were never meant to count, as in valued, or to be counted numerically, as in demographics or as a population. The devaluation of these experiences goes beyond the simple lack of accounting by numbers and started long before their mobilization and continued long after the war's end. The silencing that discounted these experiences was a complicity forged by multiple national and subnational parties in power in Korea, in Japan, the US, from the global geopolitical scale to the scale of the intimate, of the family, the locality, and the psychic. For the survivors and the survivor activist women themselves, as Professor Yi notes, the battleground remained. They never left the battleground, and their war zone continued. They continued to live on a battleground long after they, quote unquote, returned. Professor Yi notes the hypocrisy or the contradiction of the nationalist framework that denounces the atrocities of the Japanese militarism while currently perpetuating militarism here and now in the form of serving the contemporary US global military industrial complex through celebrating newly cultural industries coined as K-militarism or K-defense. She asks, what might a radical politics look like, one emerging from the ruins or spaces beyond those captured by the nation state for creating a different future? Professor Park's discussion offers us one practical site of commemorating or memorializing these past atrocities and gave us fresh insights into the continuing challenges of the contemporary museums that we see around us that were memorializing practices on various levels, official, governmental, and the private realms. And she pointed out cogently the difficulties and the challenges, especially in invoking the perspective of the women and the perspective of the victims. She shared continuing challenges facing these processes of negotiating the memorializing practices pertaining to the comfort women histories, but not just of the Japanese militarist history, but also of ongoing and pluralizing experiences of sexual violence. This negotiation is further challenged, especially by their numbers and the actual activism and the state resources that support the women themselves as they necessarily dwindle. So what is the role of those who are left behind to commemorate and historicize them? Professor Park asks about the challenges and the possibilities of making the comfort women narrative mainstream, especially through our museums. So in the remaining time, we also have an opportunity for the speakers to respond to the discussants. And following, we will also open up to any questions from the floor or from the online audiences. So if you could think of some questions you may have to all four of the presenters today as we turn to a dialogue among the presenters now. So now I would like to invite Professor Tomiyama back to the screen if he's available, and give him an opportunity to respond to his discussant.
それでは始めさせていただきます。キム・ヒョンジュン先生、本当にお会いしたかったです。申し訳ございません。
Well, I would like to respond to Professor Kim Hyung-jun. I really wanted to meet you in person myself. My sincere apologies for not being able to show up in Korea. I was very saddened to hear that you had to leave such an early hour in the morning from Gwangju, but you were not able to meet me. I actually purchased the airfare ticket, but I was not able to make it to Korea. You posed very important questions, and you just used the term comrade, and having heard the term comrade so far, I feel that we have been engaged in discussions with Professor Kim over a very long time. So that's the kind of impression I got. I won't be able to give you very specific answers to the specific questions that you have posed, but I would like to bring your questions into my heart as I continue with my research studies. So I have to think about your questions in depth in order to be able to do that. And this is a translated version of the work from the Kim Sum. And you talked about the novelist Kim Sum, and you said that the first-person tense was used by Kim Sum, and the first-person observer perspective was very important. I recognized it myself in that Kim Sum's translated version, the book of the person, Hitori. And you talked about how you embedded my statements into your thoughts. And you talked about politics. I want to give a political perspective to interpreting the first-person observer positions as well. And you talked about intellectual domain that is being set and making politics political by trying to make an effort to turn that venue into something else. And firstly, I'd like to talk about this big picture, the big topic of ethics versus politics. Politics is about making transitions into a circumstantial, in a circumstantial situations. I think that politics can play a positive role in making changes. Let's take Marxism as an example. You struggle against capitalism. And capitalism is coercive, and people are trying to come up with something that transcends the principles and aspiring to achieve through the struggle. And it can be coercive, but it can be coercive in a very, it can be embracing in a very positive way, not coercive. I think politics can be shown in the very specific situations, in a very individual manner, and in the very individual manner. The politics can be shown, but I think sometimes it can be subordinated and it can be expressed as a suppression. So if you have to look at individual situations, and you have to look from inside, and you want to find politics, it won't be easy. How would you be able to do that? And this is a question I wanted to answer myself. If you look at individual situations, I would see someone like myself, and I would see the ethical questions to be addressed. And you talked about the questions being posed and answers being presented by yourself. When you think about the righteousness of the ethical questions, you think about yourself, and you think about yourself versus the other, and you think about you versus the other in thinking about the politics. That's where politics begins. And ethics is the step you take one step ahead of politics. I think it's hidden in there as a prior step. So you take a step towards politics, and you take a step towards social institution. But this is not something inevitable, because I don't want to overgeneralize the concept of the politics. I want to say that this is about the conditions. You want to secure certain conditions, and that's what politics is all about. So what kind of politics are we talking about? It's not a question about that. I want to look at the individual situations. I want to make sure that politics stays within this space. So we're going to take a step ahead with, before the ethics come in, I want to ask a question about politics, and I want to create a venue for that. And making that kind of space is politics from my point of view. And with regards to the question posed by Professor Kim Hyung-jung, I think the resetting of the ethics, I may be trying to reset the ethics into the spatial concept. And you also talked about the insurance. Capitalism, they want to bring in the concept of insurance. And this is a very serious question indeed. People are exposed to violence. People anticipate violence coming. So this is like a premonition of violence. And the capitalism wants to present a future that is safe. And we would like to present a future that is different from what the capitalism does. And we want to relate it to the other. We want to have it extended as a power. And this is a question that I am overwhelmed by. Frantz Fanon talked about violence. He wanted to know what violence is. This is a question he posited. And he talked about the hope being realized in our world, and people, the intuition that you get. The perception you develop about the current situation is what violence is all about. And you are exposed to violence, and you think to yourself, you want to remove it as a risk, but not just simply that. You want to acquire something So this is not about negating politics, violence. This is not about thinking of violence in the positive or negative manner. We want a different perspective, and you want to be safe. I want to find pleasure in the space that you reside in, free of violence. So these are very difficult questions which we are trying to find answers to. So we don't want to think of it as make an ethical approach. I would like to think of a spatial concept, bring in a spatial concept. I am hoping to find an answer to your question in doing so. So again, this is a concept of venue, a space. The question of the ethics can be something about space, and I want to think of relationship, think of social, the social relationship. And about the knowing is a practice, an act. So I want to emphasize that knowing involves discussing, reading, writing, and talking. These are all the acts related to knowing. And these acts can create relationships, and the relationships can bring changes to a society. So we are trying to explore knowing in that regard. But these days, in the universities, you are into an academic competitions. You want to write more papers, and if you create more papers, you end up a winner. So this is a very disparate situation. But still, against this very disparate situation, I think we should think of knowing as the starting point. And I also believe that the important attributes such as these should be emphasized. In a novel by Kim Sum, she talks about horrible violence, and she talks about proactively surviving the horrible violence. I was greatly impressed by her writing as well. It's about seizing something. There is a certain physical presence, physicality. And within this ethical logic, we find the physical presence. And I think she acutely describes this presence in her novel. And with regards to the last question about my magazine, and I had wanted to bring all these ideas into my magazine, something that has a physical presence, a venue for the language. So how far did I come, was your question? This is only at the beginning stage. I'm not really able to give you a concrete answer about what my magazine is. So I'm looking forward to your active participation in this magazine in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now we will go directly to Professor Lee Hae-ryung's comments and response.
Yes, Professor Park So-yeon's discussion, thank you very much. Well, in my presentation, I think that maybe consciously or maybe unconsciously, I may not have explained some parts clearly, and I think your discussion has revealed and pointed out those concepts. I think that in a sense, just as you've mentioned, the arrival of a time where the counting is no longer meaningful, and also the acceleration of history is now at a time that we're hearing. And so I think I was trying to propose a history of representation and an alternative representation, just as you pointed out. And in that sense, the collective memory and history writing takes place at museums and memorial halls. And so in this sense, how should they reproduce the narrative of the Japanese comfort woman issue? And I think this is a very important issue that we should remember. Personally, whether it's a memorial or a museum, sometimes I kind of hesitate visiting such sites, even though I have to be there. I have the purpose to go there, because when I am inside those spaces, I don't know, what should I say? It kind of makes me feel somewhat physically very agitated or anxious or uncomfortable, especially when we see these sceneries of history. That happens to me many times. In a sense, the Japanese comfort woman issue is most public and most official memory takes place at these memorials and museums, and the education also takes place at these sites as well. Currently, when you look at the memorials and museums of Korea, many cases, the comfort woman issue is excluded, and or in other cases, the exhibition or the perspectives of narrative was what you pointed out, and you gave a very detailed explanation of that. And so when you look at this as a history of the nation and the history of the war in terms of victory and defeat, in many cases, this was the only way that the comfort woman issue was depicted in a very limited manner. And just as Professor Park has asked in the latter part, in my presentation, the perspectives and my presentation, how should they be mainstream in the exhibitions of museums and memorials? Well, that was your question toward me. Well, about this question, I have not thought about it previously, but thinking about these mainstreaming in the memorials and museums, just as you've pointed out, I think, especially in the case of Korea, this is normally led by the representation of the Korean government and the public agencies. And so in many cases, we're kind of used to administrative practices or political practices that kind of induce us to follow and be tamed by a certain narrative. But critical and, but I think nevertheless, we should come up with alternatives to meet against such narratives of the public governmental sector. And I think this session is in line with that. And in these spaces, we could think of changing our perception and bringing in new perspectives through unexpected meetings or encounters. Specific representation or image does not necessarily lead to a certain image. I think it is all about encounters and meetings. You might not know in the beginning, but as time goes on, you may realize that Tomoyama Daiko's painting, well, for that, I first saw that was not in a gallery or in a private exhibition. It was about 10 years ago at a certain academic seminar. I saw it as a slide image. And the way it triggered my thought had much to do with the activities of Kim Ak-sun, her comments, her statements, her testimonies, how I thought again and again about it and rephrased that, and how it is, and then it made me actually face Tomiyama Daiko's paper. And in a conversation with Han Myung-suk in 1997 in Sekai, Tomiyama Daiko recalled the appearance of Kim Ak-sun in August 1991 after the publication of the Memory of the Sea series. In August 1991, the name of Kim Ak-sun, who was a comfort woman, came out. It was a great surprise that it appeared as a witness of history. And it was like a vision, like a ship that knew its existence but was not clearly identified. Following that, the grandmas came forward one after one another. I was deeply moved by their reports and their coming forward, and went with anticipation and excitement. Sometimes she would cry, she would get angry and become outraged as she gave testimony, and I was overwhelmed by that sight. And now I think I realized that the day has come for the experience to tell the truth. And I thought my role, which was noting more than an overture, was over. That was what Tom Daiko had said. Well, the memory of the sea came first, and then it was after that that the 할머니es, the grandmas, came to testimony. But if we reshuffle the time sequence, we could rethink of the image of the sea in parallel with the testimony of Kim Ak-sun. Professor Domero said you should not limit it to a specific person's testimony, but nevertheless, if I think of Kim Ak-sun's testimony, it is a reproduction of her own appearance by staring at the ruins from a silent memory. That is my opinion. And I think that through the memories of the sea, it showed a moment of liberation and salvation in itself, rather than the terrible ruins that we could typically imagine. In my presentation, and also the strong inspiration of the painting was very powerful for me. Of course, we're in a challenging situation, and the Comfort Women movement is very unclear in its future direction. And compared with any time, the war seems even likely to dominate the Korean peninsula, considering the historical circumstances. Nevertheless, I think we could still be optimistic about this movement, and I want to do so as well. This optimism has to do with the emergence and appearance of the victim survivors and the way they talk of themselves. And I think that is the starting point. And the apology that they want and the reparation that they want, it is not being realized, and it may be something far away, but nevertheless, I think we can think of this from a perspective of salvation and liberation. And well, I know that I have many things to reinforce in my presentation compared to the previous presentations. Well, this has been carried on for tens of years, and the experience has been reconstructed and relocated. And I think this is something all of you are participating in. This is something that you are all experiencing. I think in this situation, of course, there are the museums physically on land and the memorials physically on land. But we don't, of course, we don't see the memorials that have reflected this mainstreaming. But even though it could be literary and subjective, I think we could be hopeful about the future. And with that, I'd like to conclude. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are out of time. We will not be able to take questions, but I am sure that our presenters will be happy to hear from you by email and maybe after our panel. I just want to thank everyone and for the hopeful note with which all of our participants have come here. As many of both of the presenters and the discussants have acknowledged, the struggle is long and is ongoing, and there are many, many challenges that we're still facing. But the hopeful aspect of these encounters is the very community and the continued struggles of all of us together. And we are inspired by the continued efforts of the women themselves, who are not only survivors, but actual activists who have created and produced the worldwide communities of which we, the next generation, have become a part as well. So with that, I think this is a very fortuitous beginning, and we look forward to further conversations in the coming afternoon panels and tomorrow. Thank you very much for participation.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much. The first session ends here, and we'll resume at 2 o'clock in part 2, Silence and Gesture, Cinematographic Translation Testimonies, conversations with Park Sunam, Park Moon-chil, and Hwang Myo-jo. Thank you.